feisty, as you can imagine, very emotive, and I'm sure we'll make a lot of headlines. Now, we're called Uncensored, our show, for a reason, is that I get my guests on and they can say what they want. I will challenge them where I see fit, but we don't edit people. We put all the interviews out unedited on our YouTube channel, and our YouTube channel is now just past 2 million subscribers. And some of our interviews, like we did one with Bassem Youssef, the Egyptian comedian and political commentator 2 weeks ago, has had 20 million views. So we believe right now we have the most watched news current affairs show on all formats in the world, which is a very exciting challenge, but also it carries with it huge responsibility.
And I was going to mention, obviously, the Bassem Youssef, the first interview was more than 20 million viewers, just phenomenal. And obviously, you flew to LA for the second follow-up, didn't you? And obviously, you did challenge him. How do you prepare for going into an interview like that?
Well, it's incredibly difficult. You know, he's a guy who spent decades. He was a heart surgeon in Cairo. And then when the Arab Spring uprisings happened in 2011, he went to Tahrir Square and he was treating the wounded protesters. And then out of that, he did a YouTube show, had a few people watching, and then suddenly it blew up and he became the biggest TV star in Egypt. And then he had to leave Egypt for mocking the president. He came to America and has been struggling, actually, as he said, ever since, to try and do a stand-up comedy routine and so on. But now, thanks to our interview, he said tickets are sold out for all his shows around the world. And he's back, and he should be, because he's an incredibly smart guy. And he has a forensic detail about the whole crisis, which people like me, frankly, I've been a journalist covering the Israel-Palestinian conflict now for 3 decades. But I think unless you actually are a Jewish person or an Israeli or you're Palestinian or an Arab, I don't think you can fully understand just how deep it goes, how complex it is. And so as a journalist, I think you have to do as much research as you can. I'd advise students there today, I have a 7 Ps rule, which my brother gave me. He's in the British Army for 37 years. And it was called the 7 Ps. Prior planning and preparation prevent piss poor performance. You can never do enough preparation. Even if you think you're prepped, do it again. I prepare for interviews. I was up at 5 o'clock this morning, 4 o'clock actually, just going over endlessly everything to do with the president of Israel, all his public utterances going back 15 years. He's got an amazing story. His father was served in the British Army in World War II, took on the Nazis, helped liberate the Belsen concentration camp. He helped capture Heinrich Himmler, who was the architect of the Holocaust. Imagine for him, his father went on to become president too. They're the only father-son presidents in Israel's history. And for the son to now go to the kibbutz where these atrocities happened on October the 7th and to see the horror for his own eyes was very like what his father saw back in 1945. So I think preparation is key. If you want to be a journalist, you've got to have a constantly curious mind. You got to wake up and be desperate to know what happens. When I wake up, as my wife will tell you through gritted teeth, the first thing I do is not wish her good morning. I go and grab my phone and see what I've missed. And I think if that's in your blood, if you have that burning interest in news, then chase it. But then when you get your chance, you've got to be ready. And the best way to be ready is to work hard and play hard. Work hard, but also do your preparation.
And following on from preparation, I want to touch briefly on freedom of speech, because obviously it is such an integral part of all our lives. You know, do we live in a democracy, for a start? How would you say the spotlight has shifted on freedom of speech during your media career?
Well, what's changed is that when I started, freedom of speech was taken for granted in this country. You know, we're a democratic society and you're allowed to have your opinions. You know, I used to be thrown out of my country pub on a Friday night for expressing my opinions too loudly after a few pints, but I was never banned from having them. I never had mobs of people conspiring to have me cancelled or whining duchesses in California trying to get me barged off TV shows. And what's changed is that young people today, and I hope there aren't many of them in your audience because they shouldn't be journalists if they are, but they seem to think that the only opinions that can be tolerated are their own, and that anyone who deviates from their worldview has to be shamed, vilified, cancelled, deplatformed, and so on. When, of course, the whole point of a democracy is we're all supposed to have opinions and can disagree with each other. And you don't have to agree with them. But as Winston Churchill said, some people's idea of free speech is that only their view counts. It's not. It's actually freedom of speech means the ability to listen to other people's views that you vehemently disagree with and respect their right to have that opinion. And we've started to lose that. And I'm afraid this whole woke cancel culture farce that we're going through is illustrative of a deep attack on free speech. And I just think I hope that this next generation who are watching this, I hope that instilled in you is an absolute understanding that people are entitled to different opinions. And even if you hate them, they're entitled to different opinions. Otherwise, we're not a democracy. We become something else. We become North Korea, Russia, China, somewhere where they put you in prison or kill you for having opinions. Do we want to go there? Or do we want to actually understand that we can all agree to disagree?
And how has your time working as a journalist in America, for example, affected and impacted your views on freedom of speech?
Well, I think they have the First Amendment to the US Constitution, which they take very seriously. In fact, I had a vivid example of just how seriously they take that, because when I was working at CNN in 2012, there was a petition on the White House petition site, which was started by a guy called Alex Jones, if some of your students may know. He's the shock jock from America who defamed the Sandy Hook families. And I first encountered him after the Sandy Hook massacre, when I was campaigning against America's gun laws and taking on the NRA every night on TV. And he began a campaign to have me deported on a petition on the official White House website. Now, that meant that if it got past, I think, 20,000 signatures, then the president of the United States, who was Obama at the time, would have to make a decision about that petition. And I was actually on air. By this time, I think 150,000 people had signed it. And I was on air when Obama announced in an official statement that he was saving me for the American people, which may not have been what many American people wanted to hear. But he said that I was entitled under the First Amendment, which applies not just to American citizens, but anybody who's in America. I was entitled under the First Amendment to comment about the Second Amendment, even if I didn't agree with it. And that was an emphatic defense of free speech and my right to disagree with what was then the prevailing mood, certainly amongst Republicans, that there should be no new gun laws and that this was an attack on the Second Amendment.
And talking about world leaders, speaking of them, let's talk briefly about Donald Trump and your interview on air last year with him, which was, turned into global headlines. It was phenomenal. He stormed out of that interview. And of course, you are friends with Donald Trump. You were friends with him since starring on America, The Apprentice. So, and the interviews I've watched with him, you seem to give him a harder time than perhaps some of your other interviewees. But how did you deal with the publicity afterwards? He was there in Nebraska calling you crazy to all his supporters.
I think it's when it got to the fourth statement from the office of the president, Donald Trump, I began to laugh the loudest. I mean, I know what Donald Trump's like. I've known him for a long time. We've been friends on and off. We're in a bit of a pause at the moment. But that's mainly because of ridiculous antics over the January the 6th riots, the refusal to accept the results of the 2020 election, which no inquiry or judge has uncovered any evidence of that election being stolen. So it's complete nonsense. And he doesn't like it. You either agree with him or you can't be his friend anymore. Well, again, this comes back to my point. It's not just the woke left. It's also people like Donald Trump who don't want to allow people to have an opinion if they don't like it. And I think that's equally ridiculous. But Donald Trump, he's a mercurial character. But if anyone is sitting there today who thinks Donald Trump can't be president again by this time next year, they're living in cloud cuckoo land, because the latest poll that's come out in America shows that he's ahead of Biden quite comfortably in 5 of the 6 swing states. So we'll see what happens. I mean, it's quite extraordinary where a president of the United States has got nearly 100 criminal charges against him. But each time he gets charged, his poll numbers go up. And with Biden looking increasingly decrepit, the American people clearly don't want Biden as president. And they're prepared to potentially tolerate Trump being back in the White House rather than Biden. So big question mark for the Democrats. In my opinion, they should go for someone like Gavin Newsom, who's the young, dynamic governor of California, where I have a home. And I think that on the Republican side, they've got to make a call. Do they go with Trump and then have probably most of his tenure a second time round completely consumed by legal cases and court appearances? Or do they go with somebody much younger, someone like Nikki Haley, for example, or Ron DeSantis? So big question marks for both the parties.
And how would you prepare, for example, for interviewing, Obama as opposed to Rishi Sunak, like you obviously interviewed him in February this year? Is there a big difference in how, the layers of publicists that you have to go through?
Well, I mean, I'll give an example more of Trump, actually. That interview you just talked about, which launched our show in April a year and a half ago. I was surprised he agreed to do it because I've been very scathing about him, as I said, over coronavirus, over the stolen election, the January the 6th. I've been hammering him in columns and on TV. And when I went to Mar-a-Lago, to his home there, we were all set up, ready to go. And 10 minutes before the interview, with a whole plan of action, which I'd been meticulously planning. And this has to, go to show the Mike Tyson line about everyone's got a plan until they're punched in the face. I got a punch in the face when one of his aides came to see me, clutching some paper, and said, the president's just been sent this and wants to cancel the interview. I said, well, what is it? And I looked, and it was 3 pages of the worst things I'd said and written about him in the previous year, which somebody had very kindly sent him just before we were due to start the interview. And I later discovered that 3 days before, at Mar-a-Lago, Nigel Farage, who of course appears on GB News, one of the rivals to TalkTV in the UK, had dinner with Trump at Mar-a-Lago. He'd clearly gone back to London, got the worst things I'd said and written about him, and sent him to Trump to try and ruin my interview. So I then got called to see Trump. And this is where I think the other skill you need as a journalist is A, thick skin, very important, but B, an ability to tap dance your way out of trouble. So get your tap dance shoes on, because what I had to do there was Trump was absolutely steaming with fury, raging like a bull. His eyes were bulging, his neck was bulging, everything was going, effing and blinding at me for being such a traitor. And then eventually I remembered, and thank God I remembered, that the local paper, the Palm Beach Gazette, had carried an interview with the golfer Ernie Els, who'd been playing golf with Trump the week before when Trump got a hole-in-one. And Ernie had said it was the best hole-in-one he'd ever seen by anyone who wasn't a professional golfer, and that Trump was the best presidential golfer he'd ever played with. So I immediately said to Trump, look, I know you're furious about all this, but there is a great story I want to talk about. And he said, what is it? I said, it's your hole-in-one. And he went, you know about that? I said, apparently it was 170 yards. It flew through the air, 2 bounces, bang, straight in, fantastic shot. And Ernie Els said today, you're the best presidential golfer he's ever seen. And he went immediately, ecstatically happy, ordered 10 copies of the Palm Beach Gazette, shook his hands like that and said, okay, I'll do the interview. So I then got a 70-minute interview. It's supposed to be 20. Got a 70-minute interview. He did walk out in the end, but I'd already got 3 times as long as I was supposed to. And that is all down to ingenuity and tap dancing. Very useful tools for any journalist.
We'll definitely remember that. So last week, we watched an interview, a fascinating interview with you with Priscilla Presley. And it was the first interview Priscilla had given since the loss of her daughter, Lisa Marie. And actually, at the beginning of that, you did remark and say it was perhaps one of the most surprising interviews of your career. In what way was that how you found that interview surprising? The most
well, she doesn't do many interviews, which is the first thing to know. And I thought from other ones she'd done that she wouldn't be very forthcoming, wouldn't be very honest about stuff. And then for whatever reason, maybe because she's nearly 80 now and doesn't care as much anymore, but she just opened up to me about everything from Elvis Presley to Michael Jackson, who married her daughter, to this shattering trio of deaths she suffered in recent years. Her mother, who she was very close to, and then her grandson, who shot himself, with Lisa Marie's son, and then Lisa Marie herself died suddenly at 54 earlier this year. So she was incredibly open and honest. It was for that reason, it was a very memorable interview. And if you haven't watched it, even if you don't really care that much, it's worth watching as just an exercise in an interview with somebody who suddenly just decided to be really open. And that was why I was surprised. And it's made a lot of news. And contrary to what some of my team felt, who felt that she would not do very well for us online with YouTube and so on, she's just passed 1 million views of that interview online, which no one was expecting either. So it was a very popular interview, not just here, but around the world, but also surprising because she'd done not many interviews in her life and none of them have been like this. And that's always a great moment for any journalist when you get someone who normally is pretty private and doesn't want to say too much, who suddenly decides, right, I'm going for it. And the other one I would say that was like that recently for me was Cristiano Ronaldo. I'm sure I'm with a bunch of Man United fans in Leeds, probably not. But I interviewed Cristiano Ronaldo, obviously got him out of Man United, which might make me popular in Leeds. But that was an interview where only me, him, and his girlfriend knew he was doing it. And for 90 minutes, he just shredded the United board and management and everything else and the system they were playing. And that was an interview no one was expecting. And that, again, can be exciting as a journalist. You nurture a contact. And again, I would say great advice, again, I'm sure you've heard this from other speakers before, but you cannot have enough contacts. You cannot make enough friends on the way up. You never know where they're going to end up. I've known people who I was at journalism college with who go on to run great things, not just in the media, but politics and so on. You just never know. So it's always worth keeping in with everyone, keeping your contacts, your Rolodex going. And I had actually befriended Ronaldo when he messaged me on Instagram, where he's the most followed person in the world, out of the blue. I never met him because he liked my crime documentaries and wanted to talk about them. So he messaged me, I replied, and next day he rings me for an hour. And this is like 6 years ago. And we now are in almost daily contact ever since and have done 2 great interviews. So you just never know where contacts are going to come from. But my advice to everyone is just keep in with a lot of people, keep all their numbers, and you never know where people are going to end up.
That brings me nicely on to one of my questions, which was going to be about the crime and documentaries, actually. How on earth do you get ready to go into a confined space and interview, a convicted killer? And you really challenge them, don't you? You push them, you get that level of information from them. What are the team like behind the scenes? How does that work?
Well, we've got a great team, and some of those killers, they're serial killers, they're psychopaths, genuine medically diagnosed psychopaths. They're very dangerous people. So the first thing is obviously to sort security out, never mind anything else. But also, it's the same journalistic rigor you need. Just incredible research. We have a great team. I mean, I will go over their research very carefully. I'll get given maybe 50 pages of stuff about these people. So that by the time you get in front of them, sometimes in Texas, for example, you get 1 hour and that's it. In other states, you can get as long as you want. So if you're doing an interview with a big infamous killer in Texas, you get 60 minutes and they don't have to stay there. They can just get up and walk out at any moment they like. So it's a real game of cat and mouse where you want to get enough in the can to justify a show, but you also want to have enough time to go after them. And sometimes they think I've become their friend after half an hour, and then suddenly the mood takes a bit of a downturn. And that, again, is the art of an interview. And it could be that in many different guises with people. But, often with an interview, you want to make those to do life stories for ITV, and you want to just spend time making whoever it is, either for the right reason or sometimes because you want to hoodwink them if they're criminals into thinking you're their friend. But you want to just spend time with people where they relax. And if they relax, they're more likely to be open. But listen, I've had some of those psychopaths are very dangerous and they can be very intimidating. One guy I was warned before I went in to interview him, don't upset him because he's broken out of handcuffs with his bare hands. That's quite a sobering thing to be told seconds before you sit down with a psychopath and a serial killer. So it can be a little bit hairy and they can be quite draining, actually, emotionally, psychologically, because some of them have done unspeakable things. But they're also, from a journalistic point of view, very different to anything else I do. So they're fascinating. But I think the rule of interviewing, whether it's serial killers, presidents of the United States, celebrities, whoever it is, it's basically the same. Just do your prep. Do your prep. Some of the best nuggets I get with people for television come from obscure print interviews they did 20 years ago that everyone's forgotten about or never saw in the first place. And the beauty of the internet, you've got no excuse. You can now see them everywhere. So I think that's my reiterating advice. Just do your prep.
So I have to mention Ofcom, because obviously we do a lot of teaching and learning around media regulation. So we know obviously Ofcom had more than 50,000 complaints over the Meghan Markle comments made on Good Morning Britain. How did that whole episode impact you professionally? Because some could say you actually turned that into a positive.
Well, definitely turned into a positive. I mean, I ended up with a much bigger job on a much bigger salary. So thank you, Meghan. As regards to Ofcom, I think it was 60-odd thousand complaints, but they all got rejected 5 months later.
You've just frozen.
Hello.
Hi, so sorry we lost you there. I don't know what happened.
I don't know.
We must have had some gremlins in the system. So
I'm on
sorry,
my
on
phone
that
now,
note,
so,
you were just saying how, you know, it was a really positive impact on your career and you've got a much higher paid, better job. Anything else you'd like to add to that situation?
Well, I just think it was what it was. You know, I found it incredible that Meghan and Harry could go on national television in America, trash our royal family, call them a bunch of callous racists without producing any evidence whatsoever, spend 2 hours whining about how terrible it all is that they've been able to go to California, live in a mansion and earn hundreds of millions off royal titles from an institution they profess to hate. And I wasn't allowed to say, I don't believe it. And what's been extraordinary is if you read, for example, Prince Harry's book, another great wine-a-thon, no mention of racism, no mention of the mental health stuff at all. It's like it never happened. I don't think it did happen. So I think I was proven right. But by that time, I had to leave my job because my media company that employed me didn't understand what free speech means. Why is it that Susanna Reid and the other people on my show everyone that day was allowed to say they believed every word of it, but I wasn't allowed to say I didn't? Like I say, free speech should mean that you should listen to views that you may not like or agree with. I happen to not believe them. I think history has judged me to have been correct in that regard. But I had to lose my job, or I was told I had to apologize or leave the job. So I decided to leave. And my other point about that was always stand by your principles. You know, don't be bullied into apologizing if you think you're right. And sometimes you got to stand up for yourself, and you got to, you know, if it means leaving a high profile job that you're enjoying, well, do it. You know, and you'll always feel better about yourself. If I had apologized to those two for their smears and lies and for not believing them, even though they were lying, I would never have forgiven myself. I'd have been absolutely, I think, tormented now by how pathetically weak I'd been. So I think stand up for yourselves, you know. It's a tough old world out there, the media. If you rise to the top, there'll be plenty of people who want to attack you, plenty of people want to take you down. But that's fine. That's fine. Just be tough, have a thick skin, and battle on.
And speaking of, you know, security and being tough, I did want to touch briefly on privacy. So obviously it's a double-edged sword, and you yourself have been a victim to this. In 2021, you complained to police about a specific death threat that you'd had, and spoke out quite openly about that. We do a lot of work around resilience and being a journalist. What do you think the solution is to being protected when you are in the public eye as a journalist?
Well, I think it's difficult because I actually complained to the police about that because they made death threats specific on my son's Instagram, which I thought was outrageous. And I did it publicly. And I couldn't believe that the police investigated. They knew it had been put on a public internet social media platform owned by Facebook. I had Facebook looking at it too. And about a year later, after all this investigation, nobody was able to produce enough evidence to charge that person. And that's where we are, where people can make death threats with impunity on social media, and sometimes nothing happens to them. So I think that is a flaw in the system of social media companies. If a newspaper or a television network did that, they would be held accountable by regulation. At the moment, social media doesn't do that. So I think that it's difficult. Look, you've got to have a thick skin to be a journalist these days. There's plenty of people, you know, I've got 8.5 million followers on Twitter, and at any given moment, thousands of them are hurling abuse at me. If you're a shrinking violet, you're going to find that very difficult. Fortunately, I'm not. I was brought up by a family of extremely strong women whose attitude to everything, however grim it may have seemed, was to roll their sleeves up and get on with it. And I think that's my advice again. You know, I think that we live in a strange society now where weakness is celebrated, strength is frowned upon, losing seems to be better than winning. You can't even have egg and spoon races at schools anymore because the kids apparently get too competitive. And God forbid we'd have competitive kids who want to win things. And I think we've just gone a bit soft. I really do. So my message to everybody is don't be soft. It's a tough world. And I always tell my kids, go and watch that scene in Rocky, the 6th movie, Rocky Balboa, where he finally loses it with his spoiled brat son and goes out in the street and has it out with him and says, look, life's tough. And it's not about how hard you can hit. It's about how many times you can get hit, get knocked over, get back up and keep moving forward. That's how winning's done. I totally agree. I've had a lot of highs and lows in my career, and I celebrated all of them. In fact, some of my best celebrations have come when I've been fired from a job I loved because I always thought it was just another opportunity. It's a chance to do something completely different. I've done everything from, when I was young, I wanted just to be a newspaper editor, but I achieved all that and did 10 years of running newspapers before I was 40. Then I get fired. And then I have lunch with Simon Cowell. The next thing, I'm a judge on America's Got Talent, living at the Beverly Wilshire in Hollywood, driving an Aston Martin and parked next to a trailer with David Hasselhoff inside it. So, as my grandmother always used to say, it's one of my Twitter bios for a while, is one day you're the cock of the walk, the next a feather duster. But if you go through a feather duster moment, it can be quite fun and quite self-enlightening. And then you dust yourself down and go back to being cock of the walk again.
So, Piers, just a couple more questions for myself before I open out to the floor. So if you could choose anyone to play you in a film, who would that be?
Well, I know Brad Pitt's desperate to because he thinks it would be career enhancing, and DiCaprio, I think, as well. I can quite understand why. No, actually, funny enough, the one I think who would, and the fact I know for a fact he would, was a diary piece when I had a book come out called The Insider, which, if you really want to know my views about being a journalist, go and read The Insider. It was a #1 bestseller for 10 weeks, but it's really the inside track on how I became a newspaper editor during a tumultuous decade of Princess Diana, Tony Blair, Rupert Murdoch, all that kind of stuff. And I think as a kind of template for what it is actually like to get to a top job in the media in this country, I think it's right up there with anything else. So I would read that. Also, it's done in diary form, so you might enjoy living these things in real life again. But I think, what was the question?
Who would you like to play you in a film?
Oh, yeah, it was Colin. Yeah, so someone wrote a story that Working Title were going to be doing a potential movie with me, and it was true. I was talking to them, and then someone said, "Well, who would play you?" And I joked and said Colin Firth, and then someone wrote a piece saying Colin Firth's fury at the idea he'd ever play Piers Morgan. And I was walking down the street when my phone went about 2 days later, and it was Colin Firth, who I didn't know from Adam, and he said, "Piers, I've just seen that I'm furious about the idea of playing you in a movie about your life." He said, "Just two things. One, I've never turned down work in my life." And he said, secondly, he said, "I'd love to play you in a movie." So the answer is Colin Firth.
Well, there we go. I think we'll have that as an exclusive. And also, what is next for you? Seriously, you've books we've had out, crime documentaries, television programs, celebrity appearances, obviously more serious journalism. What is next for you? What do you want to achieve?
Well, we've just had, obviously, a slightly dodgy journalist, author, book writer, columnist who became Prime Minister. So I think what you're probably all thinking is PM for PM, right?
Well, after your appearance on the Laura Kuenssberg show yesterday, obviously that was phenomenal. And I was going to say, actually, you must have got so many positive messages. I know I saw some on X afterwards, praising you for having the voice of the people. Obviously, you criticised the former PM, Boris Johnson, for his handling over coronavirus, and you were very much seen as the voice of the people to many people yesterday. How do you use your position of power to impact society for the better?
Well, I think you've got to, another thing I would say to people, back yourself, back your instincts, your gut instinct, because you'll probably be right. You all know yourselves better than anybody else does. And I think the few times in my life I've gone against my gut instinct, I've always regretted it. So I think trust your gut instinct, because then if it goes wrong, you've only got yourself to blame. Whereas if you go against your gut instinct and do what somebody else tells you to do that you didn't instinctively feel was the right thing, and it goes wrong, you're going to hate that person for the rest of your life. So I think, look, I just think the thing about the media for me, it's been the greatest job in the world. And it's taken me all around the world interviewing fascinating people, from the Dalai Lama to Nelson Mandela to 5 American presidents to 10 British prime ministers to football legends, cricket legends, you name it. I've had the pleasure and privilege of interviewing all these people. I've also been a judge on America's Got Talent and judged Piano Playing Pigs. So it's a wide arc, a wide spectrum in the media for all this. And I think just try everything. You never know quite what you might be best at. You might all be sitting there thinking, do I want to be a journalist for a newspaper, for an online publication? Do I want to be in radio? Do I want to be in television? Do I want to work for a social media company? I mean, you just don't know. Just try everything. Try everything, do loads of work experience and see what you actually love doing most. I've washed up after everything, now doing my own show, which airs daily in America, the UK and Australia, which is now getting gazillions of views every night on our YouTube channel. I think beginning to make a real difference, particularly in the Israel-Palestine conflict. I think we're become a focal point, which is why the president of Israel wanted to do me for the hour as an interview. Is I think that people are watching us now because we're having that debate in a way nobody else is doing. And I've got a show called Uncensored because Rupert Murdoch, my ultimate boss at the company, does not believe in censoring people. And he's a divisive, polarizing character like I am. But I can tell you this, I've loved working for him because ultimately he genuinely believes in free speech. And he thinks that everyone should have the right to their opinion. And that will do me over all the virtue signaling wokies who run other companies who at the first sign of a fluttering eyelash and fake tear from a duchess in Montecito decide to get rid of the guy who's presenting their hottest show with the biggest ratings.
Piers, we're going to open it out now to the floor, actually. There's quite a few hands in the air and I'm aware of time. So we'll go to Alex at the back.
Hi, Piers. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Piers. I wanted to ask, are there any recent pieces of journalism that you've seen that have really impressed you and made you think this is what journalism is all about?
I mean, a lot, but I would say, I certainly think at the moment from the Israel-Hamas war, there's been some stunning journalism. I mean, Jeremy Bowen is a very good friend of mine, the BBC Middle East editor, and he's been doing some fantastic stuff. There's a guy called Trey Yingst at Fox News who's just unbelievable. He's like a machine. He's on at 6 a.m, midnight, live, high energy, keeps it completely straight. He's great. And I think in newspapers, I look for people who've got a genuinely interesting take. And someone like Jonathan Friedland, who's a friend of mine, who's a Guardian columnist and journalist, I don't often agree with him. Like I don't often agree with many things the Guardian do, but he wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago. You should all read if you want to read a really good take on this conflict, because he's a very high-profile Jewish writer. And he wrote a piece about how actually, if you go through the history of this conflict, going back 75 years, you can find just cause, just historical cause on both sides. And I thought that was such a refreshing take, because actually you can. And unfortunately, we're now in a world of such tribalism that people who say, well, actually, there are two sides to this, they get destroyed on social media and no one wants to put their head over the parapet. So that was a column recently I really thought was top notch.
I think the mic's just being passed along.
Hiya, Piers. Can you see? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I know you're an absolute avid Arsenal fan. Great result at the weekend. There must have been something inside you when you were doing that Ronaldo interview, just that level of satisfaction. I know you had the Arsenal shirt with Ronaldo on the back, but as a rival fan to Man United, you must have been sitting there going, oh, this is brilliant. This just getting rid of one of the best Premier League players of all time.
Yes, absolutely. And not only that, I was hopeful, very hopeful, that I could persuade him to come to Arsenal. And actually, had we signed Ronaldo for the rest of last season, because Jesus, you may remember, got injured with about 8 weeks to go. Had we signed him, I think he would have got us over the line, not just for his goals, because he's currently I think he's the second highest or joint highest goal scorer in the world in 2023 with Erling Haaland, including huge numbers of goals for Portugal at international level. But he's still got the body of a 28-year-old. He's still scoring goals for fun. And he's won everything in the game. And having someone like that in the Arsenal dressing room at the end of last season, I think would have calmed everyone's nerves and got us over the line and won the league. So I still wish he was with us. I wish we had a striker like him now. And when I was doing that interview, I was thinking two things. One, I'm going to screw United with this, which is great. And secondly, I'm going to get him to Arsenal if I can possibly do it. And the second one I failed on, but not through lack of trying. He was ready to come. He was ready to come to Arsenal. There's a scoop for you.
Could you just touch on what sort of character Ronaldo was like to speak to and how the interview actually, went down?
Yeah, because actually he's a very good role model for anyone, right? Because Ronaldo came from absolutely nothing. He told a story of going to a sporting academy in Portugal when he was about 12 years old and being so hungry because his family had no money. His dad had died as an alcoholic at 50 from, he'd been in the war, in Angola war. And his mum had very little money, worked very, very hard, had very little money. And he used to queue up behind a McDonald's at night for the scraps that two old ladies gave him. And he tried to find them. He couldn't find them, unfortunately. So he came from absolutely nothing. And he built himself into the richest and most successful football star of all time, with the most number of people on Instagram and so on. So I was curious, what's he actually like? Because a lot of people, they're kind of one thing in public and then a completely different person in private, often for the worst. And Ronaldo was everything I hoped he'd be. We had a long dinner after the first interview about 5 years ago. He was in Turin playing for Juventus. And we went to his local sushi place on a terrace, just a few of us. My eldest son came out. And he was great because he told me about his mental strength, how ultimately he's seen lots of great footballers. And he talked about the other Ronaldo, Ronaldinho, Paul Gascoigne, George Best, all these guys. But as he pointed out, they all had reasonably short lives as top flight footballers because they all liked to party and have a good time. They weren't perhaps as dedicated as they could have been. Whereas he and Messi, he said, have had a ruthless dedication to fitness, to diets. They don't party, they don't really drink. They're incredible fitness freaks. They get their sleep, they get the nutrition, do all the basics, and it's given them longevity. But he also loved a story I told him, which was about a guy called Michael Phelps, who's the greatest swimmer of all time. And I interviewed him in 2012 in London. And I'll never forget it. He was the last one to, it was before the London Olympics. I did them all in Atlanta in America, actually, the whole American team. And I'd done Simone Biles and all these people, and they were all really thrilled to be on CNN. But he came along the last and he was yawning, bored, didn't want to do it. And I said to him, you don't want to do this, do you? And he went, not really, no. I said, well, how can I make it interesting? He said, well, ask me something no one's ever asked me. Okay, I said, okay. So we went on air and I said to him, Michael, how many times have you been properly in love? And he nearly jumped off his chair and that woke him up. So then I had a good interview. And I said to him, what's the difference between you and the other swimmers and you and the rest of your own team? Why are you so far ahead, 18 gold medals, going for 21? And he went, well, why don't you go back and ask them all, have they ever gone 5 consecutive years without a single day off training? And he said, because I did. And he said, when I stood on the side of the pool in the last Olympics, and I looked left and looked right, they all looked at me and I looked at them, and they all knew I'd done an extra day every week, every year for the 4 years of that cycle. And he said, in fact, it was a 5-year cycle, really, the last one before the last Olympics, then 4 years. So over 5 years, that was 260 extra days. That's 2/3 of a year more training I'd done. And they knew they were dead before we got in the water. And I told Ronaldo, and he loved that. And he said, I'm exactly the same. I train every day. He said, because if you miss even one day, you lose your edge. And, you know, I work every day in some capacity. I do something every day about work. So my brain never shuts off. Even if I'm on holiday, I never shut off completely. Because I think you basically start to die when you do that. The record of people who, after they retire and do nothing, they're dead within 5 years is terrifying. So keep your mind alert, agile, stay in the game every day. If you want to be great at whatever you want to end up doing, then put the yards in. People can say what they like about me, and they do. But they can never accuse me of not being very hard worker. And I don't need to be anymore. I've made enough money to lie on a beach if I want to, but that's never been my motivation. What I want to do is be a top journalist. And it's that competitive edge which Ronaldo had, which Phelps had. And I know what you're all thinking. Natural, Ronaldo, Phelps, Morgan. And I'll take that.
We've got another question.
Hi, Piers. I just wanted to ask you, when you're no longer here, what would you want people to know and say about you? Like, how would you want to be remembered?
I'd actually just like a short piece. I've already discussed this with my newspaper editor friends. A short piece in the paper saying tributes failed to pour in last night for Piers Morgan. No, I'd like to be remembered as somebody. I think, you know, I used to have a friend of mine called Matthew Harding, who was I did 9 months in insurance, which nearly killed me through boredom when I was a teenager, stepping in for a friend of mine in the insurance market at Lloyd's. And it was so boring. I nearly wanted to kill myself. And this guy, Matthew Harding, was a broker. He used to come around the insurance box I was on. And he would take me out for these long lunches later when I was a newspaper editor. And then always when I tried to leave, say, where are you going? Got something better? He said, remember, he said, live every day like it's your last, because one day you'll be right. And he died at 42 in a helicopter crash, but he would not have died wandering. He ended up owning Chelsea, the club he loved. He died coming back from a game there. They named a stand after him, but he lived every day like he was last. That's also good advice, you know? And I think, how do I want to be remembered? I just like to be remembered. Most people aren't. So I'll take being remembered. Good, bad, ugly.
Thank you. I think we've just got time for a couple more questions.
Hi, Piers. I have two questions. My first one is, you have expressed strong opinions on a variety of topics, including politics and social issues. How do you balance your personal beliefs with your role as a journalist?
I don't mind expressing my personal beliefs. I just steer clear of expressing politically partisan views. And I've never had an Ofcom ruling against me for that reason, because I never come at things from a political ideology. I don't consider myself to be Labour or Conservative. I've voted for both parties over the years. I vote for personalities normally who lead parties. I think they make the most difference because they tend to drive everything else. And I think the key thing about opinions is to have them. You know, I tell all my kids are really opinionated. I come from a family where I'm the least opinionated member of my entire family. You think I'm joking? I'm not. I think having strong opinions about everything is good. It's good for the soul to think about stuff and have opinions, but don't be afraid to change it if facts change or if you get persuaded you're wrong. Nothing wrong with that. That's actually a strength. What is a weakness is digging down into your tribal group on Twitter and just refusing to accept facts when they stare you in the face if you don't agree with the fact and the opinion that generates. So I think opinions are the spice of life, whether it's an opinion about war or famine or politics or vegan sausage rolls. Have an opinion, but if somebody else has one that you don't like, let them have it. Disagree with them, but let them have their opinion. They're entitled to it.
Thank you.
I think on that row was there.
I have another question, sorry. My second question was, what do you think are the root causes of poverty and destitution within the UK? And also, what can we do as individuals to ensure everyone has access to basic necessities like food, shelter and healthcare?
Well, first question, are you a Geordie? Are you a Newcastle fan?
No, I'm a Mackem.
Okay, thank God for that. I would have had to have terminated the entire thing. It's obviously we're still in grief from the weekend. I think it's a good question. Look, when I was editor of the Mirror, we were obviously the working class left of centre newspaper, and we did an awful lot for poverty and for trying to drag people out of poverty into more prosperous lives. We worked with the Labour Party, did a lot of good things. Tony Blair, before he went mad over the Iraq War, they did a lot of good things. And I think that it's an absolute tragedy that we live in a country now where food banks are at record high levels of people attending them. I mean, that should shame every one of us. And it shouldn't take a footballer like Marcus Rashford to shine a light on this. And free school meals and being discontinued and stuff like that. That shouldn't be left to footballers. That should be something that people with a conscience rise to the top of politics and want to change. So that's why I say it's all about leadership to me. The greatest leaders in history are the ones who understood that and who make a difference in a sweeping way to the quality of people's lives. I saw at the weekend Suella Braverman whining about homeless people being given tents. It's like, can you think of anything more heartless? Why do you think they're homeless? They're homeless because of people like Suella Braverman and the policies of her Conservative Party in government for the last 13 years. That's why a lot of them are homeless. Not all, but a lot of them are. They've been driven to homelessness by poverty through policies which have driven lots of people to poverty. So, let's not be callous to people who are the victims of sometimes successive governments who've made decisions which, in my opinion, have not helped the poorest members of our society.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question, please. Thank you.
Hi, Piers. I'm Sean, and I'm an artificial intelligence postgraduate student here, and I'm also the chair of the Students' Union Council. So just like you do, I totally agree that everybody has the right to express their opinions within the norms of a democratic society, just like you or I have the right to express our own opinions. Now, you mentioned a couple of occasions where, I mean, it's no secret that you would not shy away from expressing your opinions, and I really appreciate that. You mentioned how you were asked either to apologize or to leave your previous show when you criticized some royal figures. Now, do you think that because you were a reputed and well-established journalist, it was easier for you to stand up to your morals and principles and say, I'm leaving, as opposed to apologizing? And what advice would you give if a very young or new journalist was faced with a similar situation?
That's a really good question. And the honest answer is, obviously, it's easier if you don't have to worry about the financial implications of what's happening. And I didn't. So it wasn't, I could make a decision not based on can I feed my kids that night. I think it's much harder if you're just coming up in the profession. But I do think we're now, one of the good things about the way society's gone is there is a far less degree of tolerance of bad behavior in the workplace, for example. And I think that's a good thing. You know, people of all genders, all creeds, all colors, everyone should be treated with respect in the workplace. And I think if you do get woefully disrespected, trust your instinct. And if you want to stand up for yourself, stand up for yourself, because I suspect you'll actually win that argument if you're right. But I think allowing people to treat you badly, those days are gone. You shouldn't have to put up with it. So I would always say back your principles. And there's something powerful about doing that, you know? It's just something about being able to just not let people push you around. And I think if you have that character in you and you do it, you'll find that propels you to better things anyway. And you wouldn't want to stay where you are anyway if they're treating you like dirt. So I think for all sorts of reasons other than financial, you know, back yourself. You know, I always think people worry way too much about if you're talented and you back yourself, you can go all the way. All the way. I had nothing when I grew up. You know, we lived in a pub, country pub. My parents worked 7 days a week. We never went on foreign holidays, but I had a great early life, no complaints. But we had no real money. And I look back and think, yeah, all of that was great. I went from a prep school when my parents then couldn't afford to send me to a public school. I went to a comprehensive for the next 5 years. Love that. Love both. I think it can either give you a chip on both shoulders or no chip at all. I've got no chip at all, whether I'm with the Queen, as I had the privilege of being a few times, or whether I'm with someone in the street. I'm always exactly the same as everyone. And I think that's also the key to life. Treat everyone the same. Treat everyone the same with respect and a dash of humor. And always, as my mother always said, always dress like you may meet the reigning monarch. So just imagine you may bump into Prince Charles today, and when you work, dress in a manner that would be appropriate for meeting the King of England. That's good advice. Shiny shoes. Always have shiny shoes. Firm handshake and look people in the eye when you shake their hand. Nobody wants to be shaking hands with someone who's got a wet dab handshake. And so shake people firmly and look them in the eye. Looks like you mean business.
Thank you. Piers Morgan, I'm aware of the time. Thank you so much for being with us.
Pleasure. Okay. All the best.
Bye. See you soon.
Wonderful. 1 2 1 2. There we go. Wonderful. Well, listen. Thanks very much to Lee for hosting that one. We've got a short